I woke up to my mother's voice telling me my house was on fire. Her tone almost amused, certain I would panic. But she didn't know I wasn't there, and that house was a 48-unit complex in Los Angeles I owned outright. By sunrise, my so-called loss would become the perfect stage to show everyone, including her, that I was never the weak daughter she believed I was. I woke up to the vibration of my phone against the nightstand, the room still wrapped in the soft hum of the ocean outside my penthouse in San Diego. The screen glowed in the dark, with a single word, Mom. I hesitated for half a second before sliding my thumb across the screen. Her voice was cold, clipped like she had rehearsed it. Your house is on fire, I hope you have insurance. For a moment I just lay there blinking at the ceiling, the absurdity of it settling in. A slow smile spread across my face, and then I let out a short laugh. Not the panicked kind, but the kind that comes when you know the punchline before the joke is finished. I wasn't even in that building. The so-called house she was talking about was my 48-unit apartment complex in Los Angeles, 3 hours north, fully insured for more than its market value. I sat up, pushing my hair back from my face, and asked her calmly if everyone was safe. She didn't answer the question. Instead, there was the faint rustle of something on her end, maybe her hand brushing against the phone, and then she said she assumed I would figure it out. The call ended before I could respond. I stared at the dark screen for a moment, her words hanging in the quiet. Margaret Carter had always been a master of omission. She could throw a dart straight at your pride without raising her voice. This wasn't concern. This was theater. I swung my legs out of bed and reached for the silk robe draped over the chair. The ocean air drifted in through the cracked window, cool against my skin. On my desk, my work phone buzzed again, this time, with Grace's name lighting up the screen. She never called at night, unless it was urgent. Grace's voice was steady, but quick. A fire started in Unit 2B, just after midnight. Kitchen accident, she said. The fire department responded within minutes. The sprinklers did their job. Most of the damage was contained to one unit and part of the hallway. No one was hurt. I could hear the faint wail of sirens behind her, the echo of boots on wet concrete. She assured me she had already called the restoration team and notified our insurance carrier. Good, I told her. Keep the tenants updated and let them know I'll cover temporary accommodations if needed. As soon as we hung up, my private cell started lighting up with numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters, news outlets. In my world, the smallest spark could be spun into an inferno if someone else told the story first. I ignored them for now, scrolling instead to the security app on my tablet. The grainy live feed showed flashing red lights bouncing off the brick facade of the building, firefighters coiling up hoses, a small crowd of tenants standing under silver emergency blankets. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, the glass cool in my hand. My mother's voice replayed in my head, every syllable dipped in something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but close. We had been circling each other for years, each conversation a subtle duel, and tonight she thought she had drawn blood. I checked the time. 12:18. In less than 20 minutes, the narrative had already started to spin. I knew exactly who would seize it first. Daniel Brooks thrived on scraps of half-truth, the kind of man who smiled while twisting the knife. But that was a problem for later. Tonight was about control, not just of the fire, but of the story that would follow. I padded back to the bedroom, setting the half-empty glass down on the dresser. My laptop waited on the desk by the window, the city lights glittering beyond it. I opened my email to find a dozen messages from Grace, each one time-stamped minutes apart, each with photos of the damage, the fire department's initial report, and a list of displaced tenants. Her efficiency was exactly why I had hired her. She anticipated my needs before I voiced them. I drafted a short response thanking her, instructing her to coordinate with the PR team in the morning. We would get ahead of this. I wasn't going to give Daniel or anyone else the satisfaction of filling in the blanks. Somewhere below, the waves rolled against the shore, steady and indifferent. I took a breath, letting the sound fill the room. The phone buzzed again, but this time I let it ring out. There would be plenty of time to take those calls. For now the fire was out, the building was standing, and I was still in control. Grace had a calmness in her voice that I had learned to trust. She said the fire started in Unit 2B, a kitchen mishap, nothing suspicious. The damage was estimated at about $120,000, and our insurance would cover the full amount. Hearing it out loud, the numbers sounded like a minor inconvenience compared to the way my mother had made it sound. Grace mentioned the fire department had already cleared the building for safety once the smoke was ventilated, and the restoration crew was scheduled to arrive at first light. I thanked her, told her to get some rest, though I knew she wouldn't. Grace thrived in moments like this, the way some people thrived on adrenaline. She would stay until the last ember was cold. After we hung up, I sat at my desk with the city stretched out in the distance and felt a familiar pull backward, like a thread tugging me into a version of myself I had not seen in years. 10 years ago, I was 24 and standing in my parents' dining room in Santa Barbara, my hands wrapped around a folder of numbers I had been working on for months. It was the first deal I had ever truly believed in, a small 2-bedroom condo near downtown Los Angeles, listed well below market value. I had run the comps, the rental projections, every risk and contingency. All I needed was a $50,000 loan to cover the down payment and closing costs. I remembered sitting at that long mahogany table, my father reading the paper, without looking up, my mother sipping coffee and glancing at the clock as if she had somewhere better to be. I laid out my plan, the charts, the projected returns, the clear exit strategy. My voice was steady, maybe too steady, because it only made the silence after sting more. My father finally looked at me and said he didn't think real estate was a safe venture for someone like me. My mother added that I had no experience, no proven track record, and perhaps I should save myself the trouble and stick to something more stable. They had given Ethan $250,000 to open his first sporting goods store without a single page of financial projections. But when it came to me, there was a wall I could not climb. I left the table without finishing my coffee, the folder still clutched in my hands, and by the time I reached my car, I knew I would never ask them for money again. A week later, I sat in the branch office of Pacific Bank, my hair pulled back tight, a navy blazer borrowed from a friend. The loan officer, a man in his 40s with a tie that looked older than me, tapped the pen against the desk as he scanned my application. My credit was clean, my job as a junior property manager gave me a steady income, and I had scraped together every last cent of my savings for the earnest money deposit. He asked if I had family who could co-sign, and I told him no, my voice firmer than I expected. The moment he slid the papers across for my signature, my hands stopped trembling. The pen felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of everything that had been denied to me. When I walked out of that bank with the keys a month later, it wasn't just a condo. It was proof. Back in the present, I scrolled through the most recent photos Grace had sent from the building. The fire had blackened part of the hallway wall outside 2B, and water pooled near the elevator doors. It would be cleaned and repaired in days. The tenants would be taken care of. The insurance payout would be processed within weeks. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet fill the room. It struck me how different I felt now compared to that younger version of myself. 10 years ago, a setback like this would have felt like the edge of disaster. Now it was just another line item to manage. Still, there was no denying that old memory had teeth. I could hear my father's voice saying I was too inexperienced. My mother's polite smile masked disbelief. It was the same smile I heard in her voice tonight. And just like then, I intended to prove her wrong without saying a single word to her about it. The phone lit up again this time, with an email alert from my PR director in Los Angeles. Daniel Brooks had already started circulating a vague post online, hinting that I had suffered catastrophic losses. I didn't open it yet. There was a sequence to these things, and I was not about to rush the next move. I closed the laptop and let the glow of the city fade into the background, my mind already lining up the steps ahead. By morning, the whispers had turned into a steady hum online. My phone lit up with alerts before I even left my bedroom. Grace's overnight update sat in my inbox, but above them was a forwarded link from my PR director. Daniel Brooks had wasted no time. His carefully worded post read like concern on the surface, but underneath it was a thinly veiled obituary for my career. He hinted at catastrophic losses, tenants fleeing, and suggested that certain investors might want to reconsider their commitments. Daniel was good at this. He never made a statement that could get him sued, but he knew exactly how to poison a well without leaving fingerprints. He had been circling my territory for years, waiting for any opening to slip in. This fire had given him one, and he was already pouring himself a drink to celebrate. I sat at the kitchen counter with my coffee, scrolling through the comments on his post. Some were fishing for details, others pretending to be sympathetic while tagging potential clients. A few even claimed they had heard the building was condemned. It was exactly what he wanted, the kind of rumor that grows teeth the longer it stays unchallenged. I could have killed the narrative right there. One press release, a few well-placed phone calls, and the story would have been corrected. But there was something in me that wanted to see how far he would push. If Daniel believed I was wounded, he would get bold, careless. I wanted him overconfident before I made my move. Around 9, my assistant Marissa called to go over the day's schedule. She hesitated before mentioning that 2 prospective clients had called to ask if our financing was secure. I told her to reassure them without giving any specifics, and to take all other inquiries straight to me. She knew better than to ask why. By noon, Daniel had posted again, this time congratulating one of my former clients on a new partnership with his firm. The implication was obvious. He wanted to show the world that my clients were leaving me in the middle of a crisis. I knew the man he was parading in that post. We had parted ways amicably a year ago when his business shifted focus, but now he was just a prop in Daniel's performance. I spent the afternoon in my office reviewing the insurance documentation Grace had sent. Everything was in order. The payout would arrive in less than 2 weeks, and the restoration costs would be a fraction of that. Financially, I was not only safe, I was in a position to reinvest immediately. That fact made Daniel's little campaign almost laughable, but I kept my face neutral when Marissa walked in with an envelope. It was from a developer in San Francisco I had been negotiating with for months. Inside was a formal offer to partner on a waterfront project that would put my company on an entirely new playing field. Daniel had no idea this was even on the table. I placed the letter back in the envelope and slid it into my desk drawer. Timing was everything. That night I poured a glass of wine and stood by the window watching the city lights ripple across the bay. The online chatter was still going, hashtags spinning out from Daniel's original post. He thought he was closing in, that his version of the story was the only one being told. He had no idea I was letting him dig his own hole. I could almost picture him at his desk, smiling over the glow of his laptop, convinced he had finally cornered me. That image didn't irritate me. It motivated me. The longer I stayed quiet, the more room he would give me to maneuver. When I finally closed the curtains, the plan was already forming in my head. I wouldn't just correct the story. I would turn it into something he couldn't touch. Something that would make every investor he had courted wonder if they had backed the wrong horse. The next morning, my inbox held a single email from Pacific Shield Insurance. It was from Richard Collins himself, the kind of man who preferred to send polished, vague messages instead of direct answers. He thanked me for my patience and assured me the claim was under review. But something about the language made my skin tighten. There was no timeline, no confirmation of when the payout would be processed, only a line about needing additional documentation before they could proceed. I called the claims department, was put on hold for 11 minutes, and finally spoke to a junior adjuster who repeated the same canned phrases. When I pressed for a definitive schedule, he told me Richard had the final say and was currently unavailable. I hung up without thanking him. Richard and I had met once at a networking event in Beverly Hills. He had a salesman's smile and a politician's handshake, the kind of grip that told you he was sizing up whether you were worth his time. That night he decided I wasn't. Now he was holding my payout hostage, and I could guess why. The longer they delayed, the more they hoped I would settle for less, just to move forward. I wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Sophie Miller. Sophie and I met in law school before I left to pursue real estate, and she went on to become one of the most formidable insurance attorneys in the state. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm but alert. I told her what was happening, every detail down to the wording of Richard's email. There was a pause while she processed. Then her tone shifted. Olivia, pull up your policy and look at the section labeled Loss Payment. Tell me exactly what it says. I opened the PDF Grace had sent and read the paragraph aloud. Sophie stopped me halfway through. That's it. That's your leverage. If the loss is less than 5% of the insured value, they have 14 days from the date of proof of loss to issue payment in full. What's your insured value again? 25 million, I said without hesitation. She did the math out loud. So 5% is 1.25 million. And your damage estimate is what, 120,000. She let out a short laugh. They don't have a leg to stand on. Send me everything you have, every email, every report from the fire department, and I'll draft a demand letter that will make Richard wish he had signed off yesterday. By noon, Sophie had a 3-page letter on my desk, citing not only the contract clause, but also California insurance code violations for delayed payments. She gave them 48 hours to confirm the transfer date or face litigation. I forwarded it to Richard with a 2-line note. Per my counsel. Expecting your confirmation. An hour later, he replied with a curt acknowledgement, saying the matter was under accelerated review. I could almost hear his teeth grinding through the screen. That night I walked down to the marina, the air sharp with salt and diesel. I thought about how many times people like Richard had assumed I wouldn't fight, that I would take the quiet way out. They never seemed to understand that silence was not surrender. It was a strategy. Back at home, Grace texted me an update that restoration crews had already cleared the debris in 2B and begun drying the carpets in the hallway. Tenants had been relocated without complaint, and the building smelled of fresh paint in the lobby. The fire in every tangible sense was already behind us. The only thing left was the money. And now I had set the clock ticking on that too. My phone rang again just after 8, my mother's name flashing on the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but answered on the 3rd ring. She didn't bother with hello. She wanted to know how I could possibly laugh when she told me my property was on fire. Her voice had that sharp edge, the one she used when she thought she was catching me out. I told her the truth, because I knew it was under control, and because panic has never fixed anything. There was a pause, then the familiar drawn-out sigh that always preceded one of her comparisons. She said Ethan would have been devastated, that he would have taken it seriously instead of treating it like a joke. I could hear the satisfaction in her tone, like she'd found a way to turn the whole thing into proof of something she had decided years ago. The image of my brother at last year's family dinner came rushing back. We were at my uncle's house in Napa, a long table set under strings of white lights, glasses of Cabernet lined up like trophies. Ethan had just announced the opening of his 4th sporting goods store, and the table erupted in applause. My father clapped him on the back. My mother leaned in with a smile that reached her eyes, and half a dozen relatives started talking about how impressive it was to build something like that from the ground up. I had been sitting 2 seats away, sipping my wine, waiting for someone to ask about the 3 properties I had closed that quarter. No one did. Instead, my cousin turned to me and asked if I was still doing that rental thing. I remember smiling politely, saying yes, and then letting the conversation slide right past me. Back on the phone, my mother was still talking about Ethan, about how he had always had a sense of responsibility, how he cared about the family's reputation. I let her go on for a moment, listening not to the words but to the certainty behind them. She didn't ask about the tenants or the repairs, or whether I needed anything. Her mind was fixed on the version of me she had decided to see. When she finally paused, I said it evenly. You don't know anything about me, and I don't need you to. The silence that followed was thick, like she hadn't expected me to say it out loud. I didn't feel it. She made a short, dismissive sound, and the line went dead. I set the phone down on the counter and stared at it for a moment, the conversation still humming in my ears. Outside the marina was quiet, the masts barely moving in the still air. I poured a glass of water and took it to the window, letting the coolness in my hand anchor me. She would tell that story to someone, twisting it so that my laughter was evidence of my recklessness. That was fine. People like her thrived on the version they could control. I had learned a long time ago that the only version that mattered was the one I built for myself. 2 days later, I walked into the marble-floored lobby of the Los Angeles building wearing a navy suit and a calm smile. The restoration crew had just finished repainting the hallway outside 2B, and the scent of fresh paint still lingered in the air. Cameras were already set up near the reception desk. Reporters milled around with notepads and microphones, murmuring to one another as they waited for the statements to begin. Grace stood near the elevator, her clipboard in hand, giving me a subtle nod. I stepped to the podium we had set up in front of the tall windows that framed the street. The light poured in behind me, warm and deliberate, making the space feel less like a press conference and more like a homecoming. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying just enough to quiet the room. I thanked everyone for coming and addressed the fire directly. The damage had been contained to one unit. The cause was a kitchen accident, not a structural fault. Pacific Shield Insurance had confirmed in writing that full payment would be issued within the week, and every displaced resident had been relocated to temporary housing at no personal cost. I gestured toward the row of chairs to my right. One of my tenants, Linda Perez, rose and joined me at the podium. She was a retired schoolteacher with silver hair and a steady, warm presence. She spoke clearly about how quickly the management team had responded, how Grace had been in the hallway before the fire trucks even left, and how she had felt supported through every step of the relocation. She thanked me by name, her hand briefly resting on my arm before she stepped back. The cameras caught it all. I took a few questions from the press, keeping my answers concise and fact-focused. I gave them the numbers, the timelines, the human side through Linda's words, and made sure there was no space left for speculation. One reporter asked if the building's reputation had been damaged by the incident. I smiled and said that a community is not defined by a single event, but by how it responds to it. When it was over, the reporters filed out quickly, already dialing editors and sending clips to their stations. Grace came up beside me, her voice low. "You just took the wind out of his sails." By late afternoon, the online chatter had shifted. News outlets were running headlines about the swift recovery and strong community support. Photos of me standing beside Linda replaced the speculative posts from earlier in the week. Daniel's carefully curated narrative was collapsing in real time. At 6 o'clock, Marissa forwarded me a screenshot. Daniel's original post was gone, replaced by a generic update about his firm's latest project. The comments on his page were already asking what happened to the story about my so-called losses. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, the hum of satisfaction quiet but steady in my chest. This was not the final move, but it was the first one he would feel. The morning started with a sky the color of steel and a chill rolling in from the marina, the kind that made you want to pull a sweater tighter and stay inside. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when my phone lit up with Ethan's name. It had been months since he'd called for anything other than a perfunctory holiday greeting. The timing alone made me suspicious, but I answered anyway, curiosity pulling me in. His voice was clipped low, like he didn't want anyone nearby to hear. He asked if I had a minute. Before I could answer, he was already spilling the story. One of his largest stores, the flagship in Sacramento, had gone under, overnight. He used that word twice, as though the drama of it might make me sympathize. The truth came out in fragments. His supplier, the one he had been bragging about for years, had been exposed for selling counterfeit merchandise. State investigators had moved fast. Shelves were emptied, the store shuttered, customers demanding refunds. He kept insisting it wasn't his fault, that no one could have seen it coming, that it was the kind of bad luck that could happen to anyone. I didn't interrupt. I let the justifications pile up like damp laundry, each one heavier than the last. Eventually he shifted to the real reason for the call. He needed a bridge loan, enough to keep the other 3 stores afloat while he scrambled for new suppliers. He named a number so high, it would have made most people's pulse quicken. I took a slow sip of coffee, buying time. I asked why he thought I would even consider it, given the last time we spoke had ended in slammed doors and raised voices. He tried to laugh it off, saying family helped family, that this was business, not personal. But it was personal. I reminded him of the years I'd been a ghost at family dinners, sitting 2 seats away, while he basked in every drop of approval our parents could pour on him. The promotions, the grand openings, the toasts raised in his honor. I told him I still remembered the night in Napa, when no one asked me a single question about my own business, not even a perfunctory one. He sighed, said this wasn't about the past. I said it was about the balance, and right now, that balance was very far from even. He tried again, promising to pay interest, insisting it was only for a few months. His tone had shifted, urgency creeping in like water under a door. That was when I laid out my terms. I would lend him the money, but only if he stood in front of our mother and the entire extended family and apologized. Not a vague, deflective sorry, a real one. One that acknowledged what he had done, how he had dismissed me, how he had played into the hierarchy that kept me beneath him in their eyes. There was a long stretch of silence. I could hear something in the background, on his end, traffic maybe, or the hum of a mall air system. He said that was ridiculous, that this was a financial matter, not some kind of public humiliation ritual. I told him the terms were non-negotiable. He started to argue, then stopped. I imagined him pinching the bridge of his nose, calculating how many other calls he had already made, how many doors had quietly closed in his face before he landed on my number. He asked if I was serious. I told him I was. Another pause. Then he exhaled sharply, the sound of someone swallowing pride with no water to chase it down. He said fine, he would do it, but only because he had no other option. I didn't soften. I told him I'd draft the loan agreement after the apology was done, and not a minute before. He muttered something about logistics, about needing to find a date when everyone could be there. I offered to handle that. I wanted a full house, the kind of captive audience that had once applauded him without hesitation. After we hung up, I sat back and stared at the skyline outside my window. This wasn't about the money, not really. It was about leverage, about turning the tide that had been against me since we were kids. Ethan had been the golden boy for so long, and now he was going to have to step into a room and hand me the microphone. That night I called my cousin Jill, the unofficial organizer of family gatherings, and told her I wanted to host a dinner at my place in San Diego. I made sure the invite list included everyone: parents, aunts, uncles, the cousins who lived too far away to just drop in. Jill didn't question it. She liked the idea of getting everyone together, especially since the holidays were still months away. As I ended the call, I thought about how quickly the balance could shift when timing and opportunity aligned. Ethan had always assumed I would be the one coming to him for help. Now he was the one hoping I would pick up the phone, and when the night came, every pair of eyes in that room would be on him, waiting to hear words he had never spoken to me before. I closed my planner, the date circled in black ink, and let the image settle in my mind. Not the apology itself that would come, but the moment after, when the silence in the room would belong entirely to me. Sophie's email landed in my inbox just after sunrise. The subject line, a clean, sharp blade, demand for payment under policy agreement. I opened it and read the draft twice. It was surgical in its precision, citing the exact clauses of the contract, the percentage of loss, the timeline, and the statutory penalties for noncompliance. She had even bolded the part that obligated Pacific Shield to release funds within 14 days when damages fell under 5% of the insured value. By mid-morning, the document had been sent to Richard Collins with a red receipt pinging back within minutes. I pictured him in his corner office downtown, flipping through the pages, jaw tightening as he realized how airtight it was. He called me directly that afternoon, his tone shifting between faux cordiality and quiet threats. He said the claim was substantial, that there were questions about certain invoices, that perhaps we could agree on a figure lower than the policy limit to avoid prolonged negotiations. I let him talk himself into a corner before I told him plainly that there would be no discount, no compromise, and no delay. Richard tried again this time, painting it as a win-win. If I accepted less, he could expedite the payment and avoid unnecessary legal complications. I reminded him that the only legal complication here would be his company failing to meet its contractual obligations, and that my attorney would be happy to file in court the day after the deadline passed. He went quiet, then long enough that I imagined him staring out the window, recalculating his odds. I ended the call before he could find another angle. 2 days later, Sophie forwarded me a terse reply from Pacific Shield's legal department. They were reviewing the matter and would respond in due course. Sophie typed back within the hour, attaching a formal notice that the 14-day clock had already started and that failure to comply would result in immediate litigation. The standoff lasted less than a week. On the morning of the 7th day, Sophie's assistant called to say a wire transfer confirmation had arrived. $15 million full policy amount scheduled to hit my account within 12 business days. Along with it came an agreement to cover all legal fees incurred. When I saw the numbers on the page, there was no rush of giddy triumph, just the deep-anchored satisfaction of watching a plan hold steady under pressure. I called Sophie to thank her, and she laughed softly, saying Richard would think twice before trying to test a clause like that again. That night, I stood by the windows of my penthouse, looking out over the harbor lights. The money meant repairs could be completed without touching my reserves, that tenants could return sooner, and that Daniel's whispers about financial ruin would wither in the light of the truth. But more than that, it meant one less thread for anyone to pull, one less opening for someone to mistake my composure for vulnerability. The game wasn't over, but another piece had just fallen neatly into place. 2 weeks later, I was stepping out of a black SUV onto the sidewalk outside a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of building where every inch of marble and chrome screamed money. The air was brisk, the wind funneled between skyscrapers sharp enough to sting my cheeks. I had come to finalize a deal I had been working on for months, a $4.5 million investment into a mixed-use development on the Upper West Side. It wasn't just another contract, it was a statement that the fire had not dented my trajectory. The lobby smelled faintly of polished stone and expensive cologne. My heels clicked on the marble as I crossed to the elevator bank, a receptionist greeting me by name and offering a warm smile. I had been here twice before during negotiations, but today felt different. Today there would be signatures, champagne, and the quiet acknowledgement that I had earned my seat at this table without favors or shortcuts. When the elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, the view of the city unfolded in wide panes of glass. My contact, Martin Reeves, met me just outside the conference room. He was in his early 50s, all tailored suits and measured charm, the kind of man who didn't waste words unless they carried weight. We exchanged a few pleasantries before stepping inside. The table was already set with neatly stacked contracts pens placed with military precision and crystal water glasses catching the light. The other partners were there, a mix of seasoned investors and one young developer whose ambition practically radiated off him. We went through the motions. Pages turned clauses, confirmed initials where they were needed. My mind stayed razor sharp, tuned to every detail, every line of the agreement. Halfway through the signing, my phone buzzed in my bag. I ignored it at first, keeping my attention on the document in front of me. But when it buzzed again, and then a third time, I knew it wasn't a casual message. I slipped it out discreetly and glanced at the screen. A short email notification from Sophie's office sat there like a bright flag. The subject line read simply, "Funds received." I opened it just enough to catch the first sentence. "Pacific Shield has completed the transfer of $15,000 to your account." For a second, I let the words settle in. The timing was surgical, almost poetic. The money from the fire settlement was no longer pending, it was in my hands. I slid the phone back into my bag, a small current of satisfaction humming under my skin. Martin caught my eye, one brow raised in silent question. I gave the smallest shake of my head and continued with the signing. There was no need to share this moment here. Some victories were best kept close until they could be revealed on my own terms. By the time the last page was signed, a round of handshakes followed, firm and deliberate. Cameras flashed as a staff photographer captured the group standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline stretching out behind us. A bottle of champagne appeared, cork popping and fizz spilling into tall flutes. As we toasted, one of the partners mentioned the news cycle. He had seen my name in the business section recently, stories about the fire and the swift recovery. I smiled, letting him talk, knowing those headlines had been carefully managed. It wasn't until I stepped back into the SUV that I pulled out my phone again. While we'd been in the conference room, several news alerts had stacked up. One headline stood out: Olivia Carter turns crisis into catalyst, closes major NYC deal days after settlement. Beneath it, a photo from the press conference at my building sat next to a shot of me from an old interview, both images framed to tell the story of resilience and control. I leaned back against the seat as the driver merged into the flow of traffic, the city blurring past the window. Deals like this weren't just about the money, they were about the narrative, the version of events the world would choose to remember. And today, that version was mine. The late afternoon sun was sliding between buildings, painting streaks of gold across the East River as we headed downtown. Somewhere behind me, Pacific Shield was closing the file on my claim, their loss already absorbed into a balance sheet. Ahead of me, the ink on the New York contract was still drying. Both pieces fit together in a way that made the last few weeks feel less like survival and more like a deliberate ascent. When we reached my hotel, I paused on the curb, the cold air sharp in my lungs. There was a dinner scheduled with the development team later, but for now, I wanted the quiet satisfaction of knowing that while others had been waiting for me to stumble, I had been building the next step. Back in California, the living room at my aunt's house was crowded with the hum of conversation and the faint clink of coffee cups against saucers. Maggie had arrived with a tin of cookies the same way she always did at family gatherings, like the gesture itself could mask the sharpness of her tongue. She settled into the couch between two of my mother's sisters, the television tuned to a business news channel playing softly in the background. It was mid-segment when my face appeared on the screen. The anchor's voice carried through the room, crisp and certain, introducing me as the California investor who had turned a devastating fire into a strategic triumph, signing a multi-million-dollar deal in New York just days after securing a massive insurance settlement. The clip cut to footage of the press conference earlier that morning, then to the champagne toast in the Manhattan boardroom. Someone lowered the volume, but the damage was done. Heads turned toward Maggie. A cousin leaned forward in his chair, eyebrows raised. "Isn't that Olivia? She's really doing well, huh?" Maggie kept her gaze on the cookies in her lap, brushing a crumb from her skirt. One of my uncles chuckled, asking if she had known I was flying to New York for something that big. Another voice chimed in, a little too curious, wondering aloud how I had managed to recover so quickly after the fire. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. She mumbled something about me always being resourceful, trying to redirect the conversation toward Ethan's business, but it didn't stick. The questions came in waves, each one nudging her closer to a wall she couldn't sidestep. Aunt Claire, who had never been subtle, leaned back in her chair and said she remembered Maggie telling everyone I was playing at real estate and that it wouldn't last. Now the same daughter she had dismissed was being featured as a case study in resilience on national television. The room went quiet for a beat, waiting for her to answer. Maggie glanced at the screen again. My image froze in mid-handshake with Martin Reeves, the Manhattan skyline gleaming behind us. The tension in her shoulders eased just slightly, as though she had realized there was no graceful way out. She exhaled the sound almost a sigh and said it in a tone that was careful, but audible enough for everyone to hear. Olivia did something none of us thought she could. The admission hung in the air, subtle but seismic. Conversation started up again, but the energy had shifted. Maggie's sisters exchanged quick looks, some amused, others quietly pleased to see the guarded matriarch concede ground. She took a slow sip of coffee, her eyes drifting back to the television as the segment wrapped. The next story rolled in, but she wasn't really watching anymore. She was somewhere in the space between pride she didn't want to admit and the awareness that the version of me she had clung to no longer existed. Across the room, my younger cousin scrolled through his phone, pulling up the same article I had seen in the SUV. He passed it around the headline, glowing against the screen. The comments underneath were littered with phrases like inspiring turnaround and proof you can't keep a determined woman down. Maggie didn't reach for the phone. She didn't need to. Every approving nod and every curious glance was a reminder that the story had already been written, and for once, she wasn't the one holding the pen. When the gathering began to wind down, she helped clear cups into the kitchen, keeping her face composed. but more than one person caught the way she lingered by the sink, staring out at the darkening yard, as if measuring the distance between the life she had imagined for her daughter and the one unfolding in front of her. Ethan showed up 2 days later at the conference room in my downtown office, the one with the glass walls and the view of the bay. He looked sharper than the last time I had seen him, suit-pressed hair trimmed, but there was still that tightness in his jaw, the kind you get when you are about to swallow something you don't want to taste. My assistant closed the door behind him, and for a moment we just stood there sizing each other up. Then he stepped toward the head of the table where my mother, 2 aunts, and a handful of extended family members were already seated. Their chatter faded into silence. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying more weight than I expected. "I owe you all an apology. Especially you, Olivia. I underestimated you, dismissed you, and I was wrong." I could almost feel my mother stiffen at the word wrong, but she didn't interrupt. Ethan went on, acknowledging that the way he had handled things in the past had been selfish and short-sighted. He spoke about respect, about family, and about learning the hard way that reputation means nothing without substance. When he finished, the room was quiet enough to hear the hum of the air conditioner. I nodded once, letting the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to absorb it. Then I slid a folder across the table. Inside was the investment agreement, small, precise, with terms that made it clear this was business, not charity. He glanced at the number on the front page, eyebrows lifting slightly. It was enough to stabilize his flagship store, to keep his staff paid, and shelves stocked for the next quarter. The rest would come only after he proved he could run it without burning it to the ground again. We shook on it, the click of my pen sealing his signature. There was no hugging, no dramatic reconciliation. Just the cool, formal weight of 2 professionals closing a deal, even if we shared blood. Over the next weeks, I watched from a distance as he rolled up his sleeves, literally and figuratively. He fired a manager who had been siphoning inventory into side deals, renegotiated supplier contracts, and introduced a loyalty program that actually drew customers back. For the first time in years, his quarterly reports showed upward movement instead of red flags. We met once a week to review his progress. He came prepared, numbers, organized projections backed by research. There were moments where the old arrogance flickered, but it was tempered now, channeled into something productive. He had stopped trying to impress me and started trying to impress himself. One Friday afternoon, after a particularly solid presentation, I signed the second transfer. The way his shoulders dropped told me how much tension he had been carrying. He didn't thank me in words. He didn't need to. The handshake was enough. That night, alone in my penthouse, I poured a glass of wine and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on. The fire that had started all of this felt like a lifetime ago. I thought about how control was never given, it was taken, earned, and defended. Ethan was learning that now, in his own way. The phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from him. "Just closed our best day in 2 years." I typed back a short reply, one that left room for him to carry his own momentum. "Good. Keep it that way." I set the phone down and let the quiet fill the space, knowing some victories were measured in headlines and others in the slow, deliberate turning of the tide. This one was somewhere in between, and for the first time I didn't feel the need to push it any faster. The morning sun spilled across my desk, painting the papers and polished wood in warm gold as the waves rolled in beyond the glass. San Diego had a way of making even the most restless mind slow down, at least for a while. I leaned back in my chair, letting the salt air drift through the open balcony door, and thought about how far I had come since that call in the middle of the night. It felt like another lifetime, the sound of my mother's voice delivering news meant to rattle me, to remind me of the fragility of the things I had built. Instead, it had become the spark that lit everything forward. The fire was just an incident. What followed was the real blaze, the one I controlled. My gaze wandered to the framed blueprint of the Los Angeles building hanging on the wall. The repairs were already underway, tenants temporarily settled in comfortable rentals, insurance money deposited, accounts balanced. Not a single investor had walked away. The opposite, in fact. They had doubled down, their confidence strengthened by the way I navigated the storm. Ethan's store updates came regularly now, not as pleas for help, but as progress reports. I had made sure his survival was tied to his own work ethic, not my wallet alone. It was strange watching him find his footing, seeing the sharp edges between us dull, just enough to have a conversation without drawing blood. We would never be close in the way people imagined siblings should be, but we had reached something better than hostility, mutual respect earned the hard way. As for my mother, the change was slower, more subtle. We spoke occasionally, the conversation still wrapped in caution, but there were fewer barbs hidden between her words. She had been in the room when Ethan made his public apology, had seen me hold my ground and still extend a hand when it mattered. I think it unsettled her to realize she could no longer define me by her version of the past. The business, the family, the name I had built, none of it had been handed to me. It had been fought for, piece by piece, often in silence, sometimes in open conflict. There were moments I could have gone for the quick-cutting win, but the satisfaction of lasting success outshone any short-term revenge. That was the difference between burning bridges and building fortresses. Outside, the tide shifted, pulling back to reveal smooth stretches of wet sand. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Time had a way of exposing what was buried, stripping away the noise, until only what was solid remained. I had learned that surviving was not enough. Thriving quietly, and without apology, was the truest form of closure. I stood crossing to the balcony, the wind lifting my hair as I looked toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, deals were being made, rumors were being spun, and rivalries were simmering. Let them. I had built a life where those currents couldn't drag me under. The next storm would come as they always do, but I would meet it with the same steady hand that had carried me through this one. And if it came from the same voices that once called me a failure, I knew exactly how I would respond, by winning again so thoroughly that no one could mistake it for luck. If it were you when someone who once dismissed you came asking for help, what would you do?